We're live here at World Series News, and it's becoming customary to stutter for the first 30 seconds as the first of the live audience gets the message, the notification, and joins in. But this is World Series News, a weekend global news update, and there's a lot to talk about. Simon will be with me in a moment. What we're going to do is work through the big news that you probably won't hear about even over the weekend and make a few announcements along the way. But there might be a bit of a time for discussion, and I want to approach that in relation to yesterday's show with James Roguski. It was terrific to have James on the show talking about the World Health Organization and the current World Health Assembly that's going on. And I want to throw a few questions at Simon about if you extend what it's all about. And there is some really exciting news, actually, that I'd like to share with you now, and keep watching until the end. But take a look at this headline that's come out of the Telegraph in the UK. The World Health Organization could gain powers to impose lockdown on UK. MPs fear new treaty designed to increase the organisation's powers would enable it to enforce border closures and vaccine passports. Well, there's not a person who will watch this video that doesn't know that that's true, but isn't it wonderful when the UK MPs actually work it out, actually say something about it, and it actually gets print space in the UK Telegraph. That's a big deal, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. I want to talk about the Belarusian acquisition of Russian nukes and exactly what all that means with Simon. We're going to talk about one of Iran's leaders, Ali Shamkhani, has stepped down from his role as security chief, but picked up two new roles. And the point of bringing that story up, which kind of might not mean a lot to many people, is just who Shamkhani is and just why the media doesn't report the whole story and what all that's about. Very interesting, and this is where we get behind with what's going on in the news and follow through. We're going to give you an update on Pakistan and what's happening with Imran Khan. Neuralink has been approved by the FDA. That means human trials can commence. And we'll talk a little bit about Ron DeSantis before we go. Now, Simon, I'm going to bring you in. You're already there. I can see your heart beating in the background. We're going to try and get this show to 40 minutes or less. How do you reckon we're going to go?
We'll see.
Let's do our best. Now, let's go with Russia, Ukraine war. Belarus says transfer of nuclear weapons from Russia has begun. What's going on?
So there's three things really going on there. For several years, they've been working on what's called the Union State. And in many regards, they've merged Belarusia with Russia. But they were still separate in terms of, whilst they had mutual defense treaty via the CSTO, they still had different command structures for their military. The big step that's been taken is for Russia, for the first time in 30 years, to deploy its nuclear weapons outside its boundary. The hypocritical Europeans, many of whom host American nuclear weapons, are all squealing that it's a violation of the non-proliferation treaty, but the Russians are responding that they'll be working on the kind of dual key principle. So there'll be one Russian officer and one Belarusian officer who both have to turn their keys at the same time, like many people may have seen on some of the nuclear submarine movies, where there's always the kind of captain and the executive officer. They both have to authorize the launch. So they're claiming that it doesn't technically violate the NPT on that ground. They're mainly Iskander-M missiles that have a range, I think it's, I can't remember if it's 500 kilometers or 500 miles, but they're not the kind of big intercontinental ones to kind of, go all the way to America, all the way to Australia or something. So they're not those type, but it's kind of raised the fear of the willingness for Russia to use its tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay, or also it might be a way of saying this is our force field around us here in Belarus, leave us alone. when you consider how Tulsi Gabbard, you haven't seen the interview yet, many people are talking about her really ramping up this nuclear threat, but saying that that no one wins a nuclear war. So that's
Yeah.
the idea here. Who's
Well,
playing
well
the smart game?
the other purpose of it is to warn countries like Poland that just yesterday were talking about hosting Belarusian revolutionaries who would go in and try and trigger yet again a color revolution. So obviously, the response is that they won't use the nuclear weapons. Russia has a no first strike doctrine. Then you have a retaliatory doctrine, or if the existence of the nation is threatened. So, but obviously, so Lukashenko can say, well, if you send 10, 20, 30,000 people from Poland to cause a revolution in my country, then that's an existential threat to his existence, and therefore I'll nuke Warsaw. So that's, quite a big threat against the Poles to kind of mind their own business.
Okay, now what's interesting here, Simon, is that this is not what you would expect from a country that is arming other countries with nukes, that it would be leading the Eurasian Supreme Council in an economic forum in Moscow. What happened here? What's the big deal about these non-US related economic forums that happen around the world?
Right.
It seems that we're working on a completely different timetable.
Yeah, so we just saw the C+C5 in Xi'an. And the other end of that, so to speak, the other geographical side, obviously, is, Russia. The Russia goes all the way across the top as well. And so they had their annual meeting, and actually the group was expanded. So Uzbekistan had joined as a observer. It was odd that they weren't in it to start with, frankly. Azerbaijan came in as a guest, and Belarus was there as well. Putin gave quite a big and quite significant speech, and he was talking about all the aspects of freedom of movement. So you had the freedom of goods, you had the freedom of the services, you had freedom of capital, you had the security agreements, and then you also had the physical people moving, what he called human capital, which is a rather unfortunate choice of phrase. I think that may have been on the translation. And then the other thing that was he thought particularly important, and I think was kind of synonymous with what the Chinese were indicating as well, was the freedom of what he called technology. What he actually meant was kind of intellectual property, or in some other places they called it technology transfers.
Okay.
So often that's used like AUKUS, for example, the submarine deal. That's a technology transfer from America to Britain and Australia, and to enable them to have the next generation of nuclear submarines.
Yes, this is a big deal.
So they're talking about, technology transfer more for commercial reasons rather than military reasons to those other 5 central nations. In the end, most of the presidents somehow got there. They went direct from their extended stay in China. So it was kind of good for Putin. He didn't end up speaking to a lot of deputy prime ministers. So I think 2 of them came in by video conference, but the rest of them were there in person. So that was a big success for Putin. And the President Tokarev of Kazakhstan, he made a follow-up statement, and he said that he was extremely happy about all the logistical corridors that were going to run not only east-west but also north-south, and that he truly believed that it was going to have an incredible impact upon the development of the C5 nations. And I think that is correct. I mean, we're now going to have railways and roads and pipelines all kind of upgraded and doubled and crisscrossing the entire region. And already there's been an agreement between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who have got the most wiggly and windy border, in large part because of various mountain ranges that one can possibly imagine. But they've had a lot of territorial disputes, and every now and again, kind of like Pakistan and India, or India and China, they kind of like, have a punch up or a one day war. They've now agreed straight after Xi'an that they'll no longer fly drones over each other's borders, which obviously are used for artillery targeting. So that's a kind of first step between demilitarizing their borders, which I think is very, very welcome for all the locals. Armenia is very unhappy that they've basically been forced to give up sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh, and they're threatening to just go kind of whole hog with a European Union application for what is kind of like remaining of their country. So that was the only unpleasant aspect of the Russian kind of Eurasian meeting, though the other countries were saying, well, you're talking about doing that, but out of all of us, your economy did the best last year. It grew 12%, like one of the highest growth rates in the world. So they're like, Germany's in recession. Britain could go into recession at any point. France is struggling. Like, why would you leave us when we're doing all really well? We've now got all these growth opportunities, and you'd be like jumping from the pan into the fire. But we'll see what happens there. The EU have sent an EU mission, which I suspect will become permanent, like an EU embassy to Armenia. So they're very much kind of like enticing them away. But we've seen the reverse happen with Georgia, ironically. The airline re-established direct flights between Tbilisi and a variety of Russian cities, like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and there were like another couple. And there was so much demand for the travel, they've now announced they're going to have to triple the schedules. But in response to that, the president of Georgia, who is a crazy Europhile lady, has announced that she's now boycotting their own national airline, which is like the British Prime Minister boycotting British Airways, or the German Prime Minister, Chancellor, boycotting Lufthansa, because she's so pro-NATO and pro-EU that she doesn't think there should be any travel at all between Georgia and Russia, though fortunately the population seems to disagree with her. Though we had the second attempt at a color revolution earlier this week,
Yep.
though it wasn't as big as the previous one. Georgia did apply to join the European Union, though because they didn't impose sanctions on Russia, because they didn't want to absolutely destroy their economy, they weren't given the associate status that Ukraine and Moldova was. Now, speaking of Moldova, what's interesting there is the president there, Sandu, who went to Harvard, like the previous prime minister of Bulgaria, but they're still trying to stitch together a coalition government. And she amazingly has asked for European sanctions to be placed on her political opposition leaders because they're more pro-Russia than they are pro-Europe. I mean, you could really debate whether or not that's like treason, but it's certainly, political coercion. So these people, if they've got a bank account in France or Germany or Belgium or a business or they own a restaurant or something, for all of that to be frozen just because they want to maintain a good relationship with Russia.
Simon, let's just hold that there for 1 sec. I just want to just catch the audience's attention for a moment. I think it's really important. I'm just going to put the World Series News logo up there and just want to pause for just that thought. Now, we're just hearing what Simon's explaining here about the sanctions put on any connections to Russia. Now, I want to bring up the quote that Simon said before. I'm going to put this on the screen. This is from the Eurasian Council. So let's just go over this again. So this big meeting takes place here at the Eurasian Council. You've got all of the new stand countries involved. We've talked about this in earlier shows. The mass between when you put Russia, the largest nation in the world by land mass, China's number 3, Kazakhstan's number 9. You add the other 4 stand countries in and they're all joined together by the border. You get a landmass that's roughly 25% of the planet. It's quite incredible. We get a headline like this that says that Belarus says that the transfer of nuclear weapons from Russia has begun. In other words, Russia is giving nukes to Belarus. Now, you can look at that two ways in the media. The Western media is going to tell you that that's a threat and they're just going to go after Ukraine. But really, when you look at what Russia is building, they're saying, stay the hell away from us. We will look after ourselves. We have got the nukes to tell you to bugger off. But we are building a new world. We don't need you anymore, United States. That's entirely where we're at the moment. Now, Putin then makes this great quote here at the conference, and it says, Putin spoke about freedom of movement, goods, services, capital, security agreements, and human capital, intellectual property or technical transfers. Now, freedom of movement, including human capital, which may have been a misinterpretation of the Russian, but if it means that people can move freely anywhere in the Great Eurasian Partnership, from China to Russia through the stand countries of Central Asia and all around. And then on the other side of the planet, we are talking about 15-minute cities, 10-minute zones, 5-minute zones in the line that's being built in Saudi Arabia, a 30-story building that runs kilometres east, west, north, south, whatever it does. And that's where you live. Doctors have one floor, lawyers have another floor, and they live assumed in the building. And do you get a choice to live there? And who would want to live in a building that's got 5 minutes to anywhere, but you can't leave it? And you live in a building for the rest of your life. Now, why would they be building that in Saudi Arabia if they're part of the Great Eurasian Partnership? These are big questions. And I want to invite your thoughts into this discussion. You can use the comments, you can send an email. I'll put my email up again if you want to take part. And part of this taking part business is the idea that you might want to call in like you would on a radio show. You might want to be a guest like we had James Roguski on yesterday and just join the show and be a citizen and say what you need. We need to make this more than just us reporting great news that no one else is reporting so that people can understand. But we need to create a different way of telling the news and a different way of understanding the news. And this is an invitation for people who want to put their hand up, much like we do here, all citizens, journalists doing our bit. And there's some really great shows that you all watch, that I watch, that Simon watches, that can work out different ways of doing this. We have to be the news. We don't get the news any other way. Most people don't believe the mainstream, but they don't know what else to believe. So how are we going to do it differently to get these people involved? All of us. And that's you watching right now. Hit the like, hit the share. They're great. Hit the comments, even better. If you don't understand something, ask a question for more detail, what it all means. And I want to use this show, and I am going to cut this off at 40 minutes. It's 19 minutes to go. But I want to go right now to the UK, the 15-minute city experience, and compare the two. Simon, how bad is it to live in a 15-minute city? Not just from the economic perspective that you might have a shop on the other side of the fence and there's only one shop that sells that stuff inside your 15-minute city. So no one's talked about the fact that the price of the whatever it is, that the leather shoes that you can buy have just doubled overnight. That's one inconvenience. What happens when you've got to get out for medical treatment and there's only one doctor that specialises and it's 25 minutes away? Do you think that this is part of maybe an undercurrent with this UK story, with the Telegraph coming out about the MPs realising that the WHO pandemic treaty is going to create further restrictions, and we do inch our way in the authorities that when they realise something. I mean, only now in Australia they've made ivermectin a drug that you can go and get prescribed at the doctor, provided no one knows what it's actually for. It's quite hilarious. So where do we go in all of this by comparing the two? Have we got an accurate way to compare what the West is doing versus what the Great Eurasian Partnership is doing? I guess that's the starting point.
Well, if you take a really negative stance from it, then when you look at history and people were divided by ethnic origin within cities, you would have, the Arab quarter or the Jewish quarter or the Genoan quarter or the, French quarter. You had that in Shanghai. That was very much the case in Constantinople. Even in American cities, you might have Koreatown or Chinatown, for example. But you were still able to move freely from one to the other. It was very much a question of birds flock together. And in some cases, merchants like in Constantinople, they would come in and they would say, we want to establish these guilds and we can impart a technology transfer by doing better shipbuilding for you. And so they'd be given a land grant and the Sultan would say, okay, well, everyone from Genoa can live in that area and you'll be free from taxes for 10 years or something like that. But now I think there's legitimate concerns that it's much more like the Warsaw Ghetto, and that you kind of wall people into a situation, and then when you decide that you want to depopulate it or transfer them to another location, you do it kind of like block by block or district by district within the walled ghetto in order to transfer the population. And at that point, it becomes, classic kind of game theory as to if you've got 20 people in a room and you're kind of like taking them out, how many people can you take out at once without causing the group to rebel? And if you take them out one at a time, then you're pretty certain that the group's not going to rebel until you're down to like the last 3 people or something. And all of these things have all been planned out. So that's part of the long-term problem about putting these people into these kind of like restricted districts. But the 2 examples that came up in the UK, one was a grandfather who was trying to visit his extremely ill, hospitalized granddaughter daily, and he was having to travel through these various zones in Bristol, and it was costing him hundreds of pounds per week to travel across these zones just to get from his house to the hospital, and going kind of diagonally across the city was not at all easy by public transport. And so he was just racking up, on a fixed income, being in retirement, an enormous level of fees to the local government just to be able to drive to visit his critically ill granddaughter. But, this is exactly what people were saying when they were saying that in Oxford, you would only be able to drive from one district to another 100 days a year, but you'd only be able to drive from outside the city into the city 40 days a year. So imagine you're a grandparent living outside of Oxford, your daughter's in the intensive care unit of the hospital getting, I don't know, leukemia treatment or something. You want to see her every day or every other day. So that would be 180 days a year, and you're limited to 40 days. Now,
what do you do?
What do you do? Yeah. And the situation that we found now in South Oxford, where they're piloting the 15-minute city, is that the smaller shopping areas, where it would mainly be a retail shop on the ground floor, and then their storage in the basement, and then they'd have an apartment on the first and second floor, which often would be rented out, or the shop owners would live in that setup above it. That the people were having to pay to come into the, not talking like right the very, very city centre, but pay to get to any of those shops. And then they started even taking out all of the they took out 650 car parking spaces. And now it's just driving all of these businesses like completely out of work. And if you've got like a specialist shop, like a map shop, or like a clock repair, or furniture restoring, in the term for those is having a high threshold population. So they either need to be somewhere where there's a lot of kind of multi-story buildings, so you've got a very concentrated population, or people have to be able to drive in from a much wider area so that they still service a large population. Because furniture repair and kind of like, clock repair, it's not something that you do like every week. You might only do that once every few years.
Of course.
So you need a large number of people just to be able to get that in order to sustain a business. And so all these businesses that have been there for over 100 years, they're literally now finding that they just can't get the business.
That's right.
And it's devastating them. And so what we get is, instead of things being repaired, we essentially go to replacement products that have much shorter lifespans and are actually anti conservation, because things aren't being maintained and repaired and restored. But those cheap items that will be made largely in Asia will simply be delivered to you by Amazon, and it may not even be a guy in a truck. The vision of the future is for it to be delivered by quadcopter drones. So, this is not academic. As we saw on this recent long video explaining both the district concept and the urbanization concept, that the great husband and wife team on the counter signal in Australia, so not Australia, sorry, New Zealand,
yeah,
have put out. It's a very, not so much looking at the history of it, but it's looking at the organizations that are running it, like Strong City, Smart City, C40. And it's important to recognize that just this month that smart cities have formally merged with the C40. So that's all now one kind of like master organization that's rolling out this program. And what was shocking to me is that now every single city in New Zealand, it's the first country to have all of its cities sign up to become smart and resilient cities.
Oh, no.
Now, the resilience is being, proposed. That's part of the UNDRR, it's the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, right? And people have to recognize that that was brought about the same year as the Agenda 2030 and the climate change conference. Those were all done in 2015. So they're called the triad. So that's climate change. It's all the SDG, which obviously is the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's disaster risk reduction, right? And so out of that, you've got the C40, you've got the smart cities, and you've got the strong cities. So strong was related to the disaster risk reduction. Smart was related to the SDGs, and then the C40 was related to the climate. Okay, and now they're all merging together. So you don't even really see strong cities very much. That's gone from strong, which sounds too threatening, to resilient.
Yes, of course.
Okay. But as these folks were explaining, when you actually look through their policy documents, which I've done for Oxford and for Bristol, and in particular, where they're very, very detailed for Edinburgh, I spent several days with the help of a chap called Dr. Bruce Scott in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
He's on Twitter, and he provided a lot of the links for those. And what I found going through them was actually, as is often the case, the footnotes had a lot of workable links that actually even he hadn't gone through. And, it suddenly was apparent that they just weren't working for the 2030 agenda, that all the schemes for 2030, those were done in 2019 and 2020. Those were done long ago, right? Those are now being implemented, because don't forget, it's not starting in 2030, it's done by 2030. So they're being implemented now.
Yes.
Okay. But they were already inviting stakeholder participation to join various, committees that most people have never heard of to start doing the plans for 2050. So it's like a whole generation ahead.
Yeah.
So they're now working on a nationwide plan and a city by city plans for 2050. But Edinburgh, which is quite a sprawling kind of urban area, much like Sydney, really, technically like a megapolis. It's kind of towns that used to have fields and farms in between them and Sydney have now all become urbanized, and it's one giant sprawling area. So they're actually splitting, whereas Canterbury is being split into like 6, and I think Bristol's been split into like 5 or 6, and Oxford's been split into 7 or 6. Edinburgh is going to be split up into 19 districts.
So this is from a social perspective, this is the end of physical friendship. It just doesn't continue.
It's not if you're willing to cycle or walk, but these public transport systems, particularly if you have to go on a train or a tram, you're going to change 3 or 4 times to get from District 1 to District 19.
So I mean, in a world that's led by convenience, all of this happens because people are taking a little bit of a convenience, but to make you not drive to your friend's house and take 4 trains to get there is the opposite of convenience. So it's pretty much dead in the water from a social perspective.
In each direction.
Yeah.
Then you have, they invite you to stay for dinner. You want to leave at midnight, and all public transport is completely ceased. So, every trip becomes more like a kind of 2-day camping expedition.
Yes.
And this is assuming that, any of these small businesses are able to survive, because otherwise you're talking about a mass extinction of competition. If you look at the Saudi model, where there's going to be, a medical clinic within each big block of apartments, if they've got 3 doctors and you think that they're shit, or you've had a bad experience there, and you want to go somewhere else and find a different doctor, you may not be allowed to do that.
Simon, we're going to run out of time, and we're going to have to break our own rule here, or my own rule here, because there's something that we need to talk about, and this is what the West Australian idea now with the with moving towards the voice and native title, etc., and what this means in this pathway. New Zealand's just signed up all of its cities to become part of this smart cities idea, but there's a hidden side to it, and it involves the voice, and it involves changes to the constitution and how native title works. Explain what's happening in relation to West Australia, and then how that would affect and how the global government gets their evil hands on everything at the end of this.
So that ties in. I've got to segue into that from the other concept that's being brought in New Zealand, which is managed retreat. Now, they're basically saying that after the floods that they had there, that many people won't be allowed to rebuild their houses because they'll be susceptible to flooding again. And if they do, then they won't be allowed to have a mortgage or to have insurance. So it's totally their risk. And the idea is to pile all of the New Zealand population into these new smart and resilient cities. Okay. Now, that has to be seen in the context of 50 by 50, which is this globalist scheme to concentrate all of the world's populations into much more urban settings, and to remove all traces of humankind from 50% of the landmass of the planet.
Wow. Yep.
Okay. And Klaus Schwab's daughter, Nicole, is really, really pushing that. Okay. So the law that's going to go into effect in July in Western Australia is this thing that they've got called the IHC, which is Indigenous Heritage and Culture. And they're saying that if you have a plot of land that's over 1,100 square meters and you want to do any kind of development on it, I mean, by that, they're talking about putting up a fence or removing a tree or digging a hole for a septic tank, right? That you've got to have it surveyed, not only for a technical building permit, but to see if you're going to disturb anything of indigenous value in relation to their heritage or their culture, because essentially the whole of Australia is going to give the land and everything that's below it back to the original Aboriginal or indigenous peoples. And you're going to be temporary renters. And so just as if you're renting a 3-bedroom house from a landlord, right? And you decide that you want to turn it from a 1-car garage into a 2-car garage, you would have to say, well, I'm only a renter, so I need to ask the building owner if I can make it a 2-car garage instead. So they're saying, oh, well, because you may be disturbing the snake spirit or the river spirit or a burial ground, or, the chief third wife lived there for 6 months during her 5th pregnancy 300 years ago, that you've got to have some Aboriginal cultural inspector / witch doctor come onto your property to kind of like divine if the spirits will be disturbed. And you have to pay them a fee for that. Now, they're saying that the whole state will have to have an initial survey, of which so far only 11% has been done, to determine whether or not there's any kind of like mass archaeological remnants. And then your property will be described as having present, absent, or uncertain indigenous connections, right? But because even if there's no physical manifestations of that, for each development project, you'll have to pay to have another divination / survey done, because whilst cutting a tree down might not have disturbed the snake spirit, then putting a fence up might. And this is the ludicrous extent that they're proposing on going to. So the 1,100 square meters is basically the what is that? That's like 1/4 of an acre.
Correct.
So that's all of the 1/4 acre suburban building plots. Is that correct? Right?
Yep.
So anybody who lives anything rural and you've got like a big garden or whatever, they're all going to be, impacted by this. And, what this essentially is going to force people off their land. We've already seen the tax changes where if you've got a kind of semi-rural plot and the government suddenly says, well, now we've decided that whilst we've previously always said that was restricted for agricultural use only, that's now going to be designated as a area where you could have, say, 1 house per acre.
Yep.
Right? And that's going to change the value of the land. But even if you don't apply for building permission to build 10 houses on your 10-acre plot, right? That because the value of the land's gone up, they're going to hugely increase your property taxes. Now, they're going to grandfather that in over 20 years. But if you haven't even either developed the land and sold it off in the parcels, right, that you'd then pay the capital gains tax on, then they're suddenly going to tax you as if you had done that after 20 years, because it's a foregone development opportunity. You've chosen not to do that. That's harmed the community, and therefore you have to be taxed as if you had done it. Now, what that's going to do is, between all the divinations, which essentially, right, you're enforcing nationwide non-Christianity, right? Because you're literally detecting non-Christian spirits, okay? Then you're also depopulating the rural areas, which is all part of compressing everyone into the cities as part of the 50 by 50 and managed retreat, right? And then those abandoned lands will all be transferred to the original folks. This is, the actual plan in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, right? When they find they don't have the technical skills to manage it such that the environment is impacted and obviously food production will collapse. And we've already seen this happen in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. So it's not like a theoretical outcome. We've seen those kind of forced transfers. And in Zimbabwe, it was done without compensation, and that's what they're talking about doing in South Africa. The only reason that stopped was because the banks said, well, are you going to wipe out the mortgages? They said no. They said, well, if you force people off and they're no longer farmers and you've made them leave the country, then how are we going to enforce the debt on them? The debts are all securitized. A lot of the debt is held by the Southern African Development Bank. That's going to go bust, and that's going to stop infrastructure projects across the whole of Southern Africa. So they actually explained the domino effect that it was going to have. So the South African government backed off that, but they've still been doing compulsory land redistribution. Now, I've visited some of those places, and it's been subject to rampant fraud and corruption. And in many cases, the land didn't end up going to tenant farmers or local people, but it all ended up in the hands either of corporations owned by a few native people, or even in the hands of a hereditary chieftain. So you were taking it from, a white farm owner who had bought the land 100 or 200 or 250 years ago, had farmed it for many, many generations, had invested in building farms and ponds and putting up fences and sending his children and grandchildren to technical school to learn all the agricultural skills. Suddenly it all gets transferred to some chieftain, and it's then grossly mismanaged, as has happened for many of, for example, the sugarcane farms suddenly got full of weeds, and they became unmanageable. Now, the UN scheme to rectify that, should that occur, having seen what has happened in Zimbabwe and South Africa. In Zimbabwe, food production collapsed to such an extent that you had famine. Okay? So the UN's like, well, we'll let you have a go at it, but even though we know that it's almost inevitable that you're not going to be able to manage it, then the fallback position will be that we'll come in and take it over. And then all of a sudden, everything's going to be put into United Nations Trust, and they transfer the management responsibilities to like Bill Gates and George Soros.
There you go. And that's how you achieve world government.
That is how everything is taken from the people and given to the globalists. But it's kind of like death by multiple slices. Just like the introduction of the racial health laws, with the Arnon Pass and all that kind of stuff in Germany. It's like, you can't have this type of job, then you can't have that kind of job, then you can't live there, then you can't have a farm, then you have to have vaccinations, then you can't marry that person. And it's all kind of like, bit by bit by bit by bit. And the people with foresight see that it ends up in genocide and depopulation. But the masses just think, well, this is crazy and it can't possibly go any further. And they all end up being, pushed into a ghetto. And this is exactly what we're seeing.
Exactly. Now,
because these globalists, they want to depopulate large segments of the earth. People can look it up. It's just 50x 50 by 50, or they can look up the rewilding project. That's being done all over Europe now, rewilding.
Now, here's the thing. It's not just something that's coming. It's something that's happening right now. So you've got Tedros leading out the World Health Assembly, and regardless of the status of the negotiations regarding the proposed pandemic treaty and the proposed amendments to the international health regulations, the WHO is busy implementing many of the systems that are supposedly being negotiated. So it's happening right now. 2030 is when it ends, not where it starts.
So people need to understand that even on the third edition, the 2005 edition of the international health regulations, right? They have a network both with national health ministries and the what they call the quangos. So like the AHRP in Australia, or ACOG, right? Or the FDA or the CDC, right? So they have top-down relationships and they have sideways recommendations, right? So these big bodies like the World Health Organization, they disseminate this advice through three mechanisms. They have regional conferences, they have regulations, which in theory are binding upon every member nation other than Iran and the United States. And then they have recommendations. But a lot of states, like California, for example, they take a World Health Organization recommendation as if it's a national law, and they immediately start implementing it.
Yes.
And lots of insurance companies, whether it's for health insurance or for employer or business liability, they write that into the insurance policies. And they say, oh, well, if you're not meeting the World Health Organization recommendation on air filtration in your workplace, we're not going to give you employer's liability insurance, which you have to have as a condition of running a factory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's how this stuff gets brought in sideways as well as top down.
Yep. Death by 1,000 lawfare cuts, if you will.
And the penalties for not having it are astronomical. You literally get put out of business.
There you go.
And so, that people need to understand that, they are trying to give the health regulations a lot more teeth so that they can be enforced not only by your local health inspector or your local medical officer, but that external organizations from even outside the country can cause it to be enforced.
Yeah. Now,
and
Simon...
so it's amazing that very belatedly you've got the British Parliament are finally waking up, but even then they think, oh well, people might be prohibited from traveling overseas, or that we could be put under a lockdown again. But what they're talking about in the proposals is literally like forced vaccinations, as were provided for in Western Australia. They said that the military could literally come into your home, strip you naked, hold you down, and forcibly inject you. And that provision was not put in for COVID. That was put in 2016.
Yeah.
Why were they giving the military permission to forcibly vaccinate people in 2016 in Western Australia?
Yeah.
But that's now the kind of model for what they want to be able to do worldwide.
Now, we're down to our last couple of minutes. I just want to make this point that if we go down the World Health Organization pathway, there is a vote coming up for this pandemic treaty.
Well,
now,
there'll be the pandemic treaty. Not everyone has to join that for a framework to be initiated. The most immediate problem is the fourth edition of the International Health Regulations, which, if passed, will become binding upon all of the member nations unless they specifically opt out within a certain time frame, which many of them will accidentally fail to do, right? So normally everything is done at the World Health Assembly by consensus, but there is provision for a member nation to say, I want a floor vote, in which case it can be jammed through on a 2/3 vote. Now, they couldn't get that last year, and it's not going to be voted on this year because they're still all arguing about the small print. But next year, it's highly likely that it will go to a vote because countries like Russia are very concerned about the impact
that it may generate for a foreign organization to come in and suddenly take over their health sector. So it's likely to come down to a vote. And what's going to be important is what Africa does. Now, Africa, their main bugbear, ironically, was not about sovereignty, it was about equity. And they felt that they had been stiffed on the vaccine distribution. And because like Australia and Canada were like buying up like 5 years of production rather than having everyone double jabbed and then sending everything else that was made to Africa. Right now, that probably was a lifesaver for them with the benefit of hindsight. But at the time, they felt that they'd been racially discriminated against. Okay. So that's the equity issue. Now, the other issue was about intellectual property transfers, and countries like Egypt and South Africa that have quite developed vaccine production facilities were saying, right, you give us all the information and then we can make it and distribute it in Africa cheaply. But Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna didn't want to do that. Okay. So that was the two reasons that the pandemic treaty wasn't done on an emergency basis a year ago, because it was close. But when the Europeans and the Americans did the head count, they realized we don't have enough votes to get 2/3. So they said, okay, we're going to do the international negotiating body and do it like a traditional treaty. But even now, that's turning out into a problem because they don't think they can get enough countries to sign it initially. So now they're doing it as a framework convention so that people can join it bit by bit. So the game that's the most threatening immediately is the fourth version of the international health regulations with severe enforcement mechanisms added to it.
And who's against it?
Well, Russia's definitely got concerns about it. Africa, now that they've seen that getting the mRNA injections was actually not a good thing, and they were lucky to have not been given them 2 years ago, they are very, very hesitant about that, because their great fear is medical colonialism. And they don't want, for a choice of another country, Belgium or France or England, to be able to say, well, you're doing a really shitty job of injecting all your people, so we're going to send in 5,000 army in order to forcibly inject everyone. They're like, we never, ever want that to happen again.
So Africa is resistant to signing the IHR4 along with Russia at this stage. But the West seems content to line up and just let it subcontract out.
You see, so that's 54 countries, some of which will be bribed. Okay? Plus Russia. So, and that's out of like 192 plus the Vatican plus the PLO plus the Knights of Malta or something, right? And so, you know, the numbers start getting real close to 2/3. Can they get, you know, so if it's 2/3 of 192, they need like 130 odd, right? So if let's say you lose 50, including Russia, goes from 192 to 142, they're literally like fighting over 10 countries. Will it go through or will it not? So it's a real close run thing. Now, the whole of the European Union plus Britain, they've already said, we already agree. Like all of us, we agree. Okay? And America and Canada have already said that they agree. And then there's like a lot of maybes. Now, the big issue is whether or not China thinks that it can be dictating that through the WHO. And it could basically get the WHO to start declaring emergencies all over the place.
And what
But
would be
if-
the benefit of that
Well, for
China?
extending their influence. But frankly, they're having such a great power grab with the Greater Eurasian Partnership in the new era that it's really hard to see why they'd want to go the medical route as well. And bear in mind that even though they're a huge country, like India gets one vote, China gets one vote. But China's got the same population as Africa. Africa is going to get 54 votes. So I don't think China wants to be part of a system where Africa can outvote them 50-1. All right. So if China ends up saying no, they may say we agree, for example, with vaccine passports, and because they want to, China has specifically said at the G20 in Indonesia last year, they wanted to run the global vaccine passport system. They offered to run it. They said, we have the technology, well, run it for free, and we can start next week. And everyone was they're really keen on running that for some reason. That kind of made the other people a bit kind of concerned. But I think that they would love to have the date of birth, the address, a DNA sample, and the medical history of the entire planet. Okay,
And a microchip.
but without anybody being able to enforce it on them.
Yes. But as we've gone over time for the second time, I'm going to wrap it very quickly with this. Simon,
wrap it up.
Here's the line. Elon Musk, Neuralink, says it has FDA approval for study of brain implants in humans. And there's their link, their tweet there. We are excited to share that we have received the FDA's approval to launch our first in-human clinical study. This is the result of incredible work by the Neuralink team in a close collaboration with the FDA and represents an important first step that will one day allow, there you go, to put chips into people's brains.
Just as Klaus Schwab said, the chip in your clothes, then the chip in your hand, which has already been done in Sweden and Japan, and then the chip in your head.
Can you believe that? We've already arrived.
And he said that in 2016.
And here we are in 2023 with all of this supposedly being wrapped up by 2030. You're watching it here first on World Series News. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for everyone for your comments, for sharing. If you've sent an email and if you can follow the page, that'd be terrific. Now, I put up earlier that we have a schedule now, a strict schedule, 9 a.m. Monday, Sydney time, 9 a.m. Thursday, 9 a.m. Saturday. We'll do 3 live shows a week, and that would make it in Sunday night, 7 p.m. Florida time, and then the same on Wednesday night and Friday night are the new times. And I'll be going on to the radio next Monday at TNT Radio from 1 p.m. doing a brand new show. They're calling it Compass, and it'll be a very interesting look at the news from around the world with help from Simon, from what you're hearing now. But it will be a different show, and that's why we're going to keep the details on World Series News and get stuck into it as much as we possibly can and provide as much detail. And lucky enough to have another shot on the radio. And we will see us all, and I'll keep you up to date on everything. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Simon. And see you all on the next show.